There's always a key matrix for keeping up sharing more of that. What is that actually
Okay, let's get started. So from last week's lecture and on Monday's lecture, we introduced the steps of access control. And we know if a user wants to access some resource in a computer system, then the first two steps for the user is to identify itself, claim who he is or who she is. And that's only the first step from the user side. And from the system side, the system needs to verify whether this claim is valid or not. So that's about authentication. And for these two steps, the major purpose is to make sure this entity, this identity is truly match with the claim. So, but the primary goal for the system is to control which entity can access what kind of resource. So today we will talk about the next two steps, authorization and access control. So this is the outline of the topics we will cover today. We will start with some basic concepts of authorization and access control. Then we will briefly go through 4 access control models. These are the discretionary access control, role-based access control, mandatory access control, and attribute-based access control. And in the end, we will summarize all the key points about this topic, and we will, if time limits, we will demonstrate how discretionary access control is implemented in Linux system regarding the file permissions in most Linux systems. So what is authorization? Well, this is the definition from NIST. So it's basically about the right or permission that is granted to a system entity to access some system resource. So it's about authorization. So it's about giving access right to some entity, or in some context, we use permission, or sometimes we use access model. So these 3 terms are interchangeably used. So permission, access right, or access model. And what is access control? So it's about the prevention of unauthorized use of a resource, including prevention of the use of resource in an unauthorized manner. So this corresponds to the first page. That's the cybersecurity principle number 1. That all the assets, all the resources in a system should only be given access to an authorized and authenticated entity, and should be only accessed in an authorized way. So basically, access control is the security control or security countermeasures that is to prevent unauthorized access into some resource in our systems. So this resource could be some files in our system, or could be some data, could be some process, some hardware resources, memory, CPU. So it's a general term. And we have learned some of these security functions So here I give you a summary on all these security functions. So identification, as I mentioned, it's about a claim of which entity is. And authentication is about the system verifying the credentials of an entity or of a user that the claim is valid. With these two steps, then the authorization is to grant some permission to an entity to access some resource. While access control is, you can interpret it as the process or implementation of authorization. So how this authorization is implemented is based on some access models. So access control provides these access rights at a more granular level. So basically, an entity should be given minimum access or least access right to some entity. So how to specify all these the rights and for different entities, then it's not possible, it's not proper to just give, full access or no access to an entity in the system. So in many cases, the systems are quite complex. So we need to specify what kind of entities can access which part of a resource or which part of a file. So all these things need to be specified at a more detailed level, more precise level. And for these 4 steps, then an entity can access some resource in a system, but we need to make sure the entity did follow the rules. So the entity cannot do something else. So the system need to make sure the resources is accessed in an authorized way. So how can we do this? Then we need extra measures, which is called audit. So it's an independent review of the system and activities in order to test whether the system is under good control or to ensure the entity comply with the policy that is already in the system. Also, if there's some access control breaches, we also call security breaches, then this audit activity can detect these kind of breaches. And also, for the later use, in the later time, this audit will provide some recommendations or suggestions, or we can interpret as an improvement on the current policy. So which part is not properly implemented, which part can be further improved on. So these 5 steps compose the whole access control. And it is used in operating systems, it is used in different systems, or web-based systems that may be like HR systems in a company, in a university, or in an enterprise. So this is a kind of visualized picture of these functionalities. So in this picture, you see in this diagram, like we have a user who wants to access to a system, a computer system. So the user needs to identify himself to the system, together with password or maybe with some other authentication measures or factors. These the username and this password, they together are considered as credential in the system. So the system will verify whether the credential is valid or not. If this credential is valid, then the system needs to make sure what kind of resource can this credential, can this entity access? Then there's a authorization database. So this access control function will talk to this database. In this setting, there's always another element. We can say security administrator. So this security administrator, they set up all the authorization list, the database for all the users in the system. So when a user is authenticated, then this access control function will communicate with this database to make sure what kind of resource can be accessed by this specific user. And after this communication, then the access control function will grant the access right to this user to access some resources in the system, like files, like database. And this whole process needs to be audited, need to be tracked. So this auditing process provides accountability in the system. So this is the general picture of the access control steps. Is there any question about this high-level introduction? Okay, so let's continue. So from this introduction, you may think, okay, this access control seems to be quite the technology, quite logical or technological term. But in fact, in real world, we experience the access control in our daily life. We have different access control in our daily life. For example, you use key to open your home. And you try to enter this building after the working hour, then you need to use your student card. And together with student card, you also need to provide your PIN code for the student card. Then you can enter this building. But your student card may only enter into the date block, not biological block. So that's another layer of access control. And when you enter into this date block, you want to enter some rooms. Maybe you can only use your key. You can only enter into the study hall, the study room, not my office, right? So these are the layers of access control, each steps. And also, this access, sometimes it depends on attributes like time and the locations. We already, in the previous example, we already mentioned, because this building, we are in a university, it's more open. So there's no need, like for the working hours, we have this strict access control. But after working hours, we need this access control to protect our assets from being stolen or from being damaged. But in some companies, or security companies, or in military base, then you can imagine. So each step, the employee needs to go through all the access control, even during the working time, right? This is what we experience every day, right? And another good example for access control is when we travel to other places, then we need to go to the airport. Then the first thing we need to provide before we can enter into is, especially when we travel abroad, then we need to bring our passport and also boarding pass. So then we need to scan our boarding pass, and maybe in some situations there will be an official staff, they will check our passport and to see whether our identity matches the boarding pass, the name on the boarding pass. This is the first step of access control. And then we will need to go through the security check. The airport needs to make sure each passenger does not bring some illegal items in their luggage. So only the passengers who has no illegal items in the baggage, they can be allowed to further access to the airport. This type of, you see, it's some properties, some attributes of some features bind to this passenger. And we will introduce this, it's called attribute-based access control. And after that, we will wait for boarding. And in the final step, when we try to board, then still we need to scan our boarding pass to make sure. For some longer flight, they will also personal staff to double check this boarding pass and passport. So these are the access control in the physical world that we experience. We all have this such kind of experience. Are there any other examples we experience access control in real life?
Bank terminal, you pay for groceries.
Yes, yeah, yes, yeah. You need to provide your credential, then you can pay for what you buy. Yes. Or some other examples. If you think more closely, you can find many similar examples. Basically, if you want to access something, then you may have this control. Maybe another example is when we discussed this hierarchical based access control. Like if you have a friend with a child visiting you, and of course this child, like the little child, and this little, suppose it's a boy, and he's quite curious about everything, and you have bad experience. He has already ruined some of your stuff, like broke your glasses, or make your cabinet very dirty. So you already have the experience. Then for the next time, of course, you will welcome your friend to bring their child to visit you. But then you may try to hide some of your valuable items into drawers, maybe even lock it, right, to prevent this child, this small kid, this curious kid, being access to some of your valuable stuff, or maybe your valuable pictures or different items. So these are the access control we experience in our daily life. In the digital world, we also have this kind of access control, and that's our focus in this course. So first, access control, like when we try to access some website, we always experience this login process. We need to provide our username and we need to provide our password. Sometimes they even have this captcha to make sure this is not accessed by a machine, by a computer. It's accessed by a human being, right? And these are like what we experienced, what we noticed about access control. But there are some back-end access control, like in the network context. So some facilities cannot be accessed, and they have this, they set the port or set the firewall to filter out some incoming traffics. So that's another type of access control. For example, for me, I can directly connect my iPad Pro wireless to my Mac. Then I can mirror my screen of iPad to Mac. So it's very convenient. So I used it to make some notes. So I plan to use this for this course as well. But in the university network, they already set up. They cannot. they cannot accept, they cannot allow some incoming traffic like the software I used in my laptop. So I have to connect them with the cable. So if I haven't done this, then I won't notice there's this kind of access control in the network. And also some file permissions in most operating systems. Like for normal user in Windows, then you are allowed to install many things. And in Linux or in OS, if you are not a root user, then you may be allowed to use some applications and softwares. But when you try to install it, then you might encounter some problems, some issues. So only the root user is allowed to install some third-party softwares and applications. That's like what I have announced in the MidUIB. When you try to install VirtualBox, because VirtualBox will get access the resources of the hardwares, then the new version of macOS, then it has implemented more strict restriction, basically more strict access control, to make sure only the root user can allow VirtualBox to use the resources in our hardware in the Mac laptop. So there are a lot more access controls in the digital world. So we will go through this. There are some general requirements about access control when it comes to security. And this is an incomplete list of some basic requirements for different access models. So first, reliable input. So this is the first step. This is a major purpose of identification and authentication. So when the policy about access is set by the administrator. So the one important thing is the input an entity, this entity is authenticated. If the entity is not authenticated, or if the entity is compromised, then whatever the access control is implemented in this system, there will be security breaches, right? Suppose if your laptop, your username and password has been compromised, has been stolen, because the access control policy only rely on the authenticated users, authenticated identity. So it does not rely on this specific person. It relies on these credentials. If the credential is compromised, then all the subsequent access control measures won't take any effect. This is the first requirement. The second requirement is called the fine specifications. So it's basically about to have a detailed list, detailed information about which entity, which identity can access what kind of resource. So it should be quite detailed, should specify to different roles or different persons, different identities in the system. And the third one is called least privilege. This is the basic principle about the access control. As you can see from the text, least privilege. So it's not given extra privilege, extra access right to an entity. So if an entity wants to perform some task, for carry out this task, of course, this entity needs some access right, needs some permissions or some privilege. This policy should set such that this entity can only have all the permissions that is needed for carry out this task, no more than that. That's all the permissions rights is set at the minimum level to identity. In some cases, it's also called this zero access principle. So basically, for a secure system, an asset should be only given access if that identity has already been specified in the access control list. And another one is this separation of duty. So it's about the mainly for the role-based access control. So for role-based access control, it is closely aligned with some organizations. And for different users, they may have different roles in an organization. Like for me, I'm an instructor in this course, then I will access, I can access the MIT-GIB, I can get all the information of students, and I can read finally, I can read the grade of all the assignments, mandatory assignments for each student. And as instructor in the university, they also give us some access to other courses. So I can visit some other courses web page. I can see some files, like slides uploaded by the instructor. But I won't be allowed to, and I shouldn't be allowed to get the information about student grade. That's about student privacy. So, and this is for the instructor, for the access right about instructor. And like as I'm an employee in the university, so I can access some other resource, like I can use UIB account to download some research papers I'm interested in the database. So these two access rights should be isolated properly. Also, like another example, for example, for the head of department, Pina. So since she's the head of department, she will get extra privilege than most of the others in our department. But meanwhile, she's also a normal employee in the university. So these two duties are given different privilege in the system, in the organizations. They shouldn't be mixed. They should be properly isolated. They should be properly separated. So this is about this separation of duty. And another one is called open or closed policies for the access control. For open policies, it means all the users, all the identities in the system are allowed to access all the files, except some users are specified not to be able to access some resource. So you can interpret it as a blacklist. So if, I'm not sure whether you have set some of your old friends in the contact list as a blacklist. So basically, anyone can call you, but if you really dislike this person, or you got some advertisement call by a certain number, and you are really alarmed by that, you may set this number into your blacklist. Then it means this call won't be reaching you. So this is about open policy. So each user has the maximum access right, except there's some specific list mentioned. Some users cannot access some resource. So the opposite one is closed policy. So it means all the users are not allowed to access all the resource, except some users in the access control list already given access, already mentioned, can access to some resource. So we can consider it a whitelist and blacklist in this context. And we also have this policy combination and conflict resolution, also this administration policies. So the last two is at the management level, because as I mentioned, and for all these access control, these measures, it is implemented based on the access control policies. But who will set these policies? These policies will be configured by security administrator in the system, but the security administrator won't set these policies. It's more about the organization, some like HR or some manager in the system. They set, okay, which user, which identity has which kind of access rights. But these are separate. So for the system administrator and the whole system, maybe management or like the head of the system, they will specify which employee can have what kind of access rights. So these are the general requirements of access control. There are some basic elements of access control systems. So these are the terms that you need to remember. So just to make things easier to explain or to communicate with others. So in the system, if an entity wants to access some resource, we call this entity subject. This subject could be a process, or could be a software, could be a user in the system. The resource, or we also mention assets, the resource in the system to be accessed by this subject, we call it objects. So these objects could refer to some files, maybe some pictures, some movies, some music. These are all objects. And for these objects, when it can be accessed, when we say access, what do we mean by access? So we can specify access rights, like a file, like whether a user can read a file or whether a user can edit, we call it write, or whether a user can write some extra text into a file, or whether a user can delete all the text in the file. And also, if the object is software, if it's executables, then whether this object can be executed by a certain subject. So we can, in different systems, in different contexts, we may have different access rights bound to objects. So basically, you see that for the summary, it's just a subject access an object through certain access rights. Like when we talk about a lot of things, a lot of activities in the computer system, then if you try to classify all these activities, then in fact there are not many activities. Like you either read a file, either you read a Word file, read PDF file, you play a video, you play music. We can consider it's read. But for play video, we can also consider it's execute some softwares to play the music. Now, when we edit some files, like when you write a report, then in the process, you may need to modify, you may need to revise, and you may need to delete some of the text that you don't like. But all this process, it's right? And there's some other characteristic about these access rights. Like if you create a file, then you own that file. But in sometimes you own some files, doesn't mean you have all the control on that file. You are just a creator of some file. But the access right bound to this file could be assigned by others. not just the owner, the creator of the file. So these are the basic elements. So in general, we have 4, or we can say 5 access control models. The first one is discretionary access control model. And the second one is a mandatory access control model. Third one is role-based access control. And on top of it, there's extra one called rule-based access control model. And the last one, the attribute-based access control model. All these models, it specify how the access right is assigned and how the resources is accessed. So you can interpret it as different ways to specify the access control, the steps of access control. And these models, they are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So in many systems, they can combine different models to implement higher secure access control, because they are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And in practice, like for the discretionary access control and the mandatory access control, they are implemented together in many operating systems. So what is discretionary access control? From this word, it's discretionary. Basically, it means the owner of a file or the owner of a resource can assign access right to different users, to different subjects. So the owner of the file has this right to access permission to others. So that's why this discretionary in this context. For the mandatory access control, it's different. So even a user is the owner of a file, but this owner is not allowed to give access rights to others. These access rights are assigned by the system. So it's more like in the organization. So even you write some report, and it doesn't mean you can give this report to anyone. So you just hand in report to your boss, and then you have no control who can read this report. So this is called mandatory access control. And for role-based access control, it also comply together closely with the organization based on some functions, some job positions in our organization. Because when we talk about computer system, it's not just your own laptop. It could be an HR system in an enterprise. Then it means this HR system needs to map well with all the roles in a company, in an enterprise. So a healthy system shouldn't rely on a specific person. Instead, it should rely some job positions, some specific positions. So the user, the person who's at that position can be replaced. And if that happens, then the system shouldn't be affected at all. So that's a healthy system. Otherwise, if in some companies, if the CEO has some health problem, then the company is supposed to run as before. That's a healthy system. That's a more robust system. If the boss has some problem and cannot carry out his normal work, his daily job task, then if the system just collapses, that's really vulnerable system, right? So this is about this role-based access control. So users will be assigned to roles, and the roles will be assigned permissions to some resource in the system. In the end, this attribute-based access control, these are more detailed specifications on objects, on the subjects, depending on locations, times, different attributes. So we will also talk about this. So let's have a 15 minutes break, then we continue.